Over to other news stories, let's shift our focus over to the peace talks between the United States and Afghanistan, as U.S. President Donald Trump has now called off the peace talks with the Taliban. This after the terror group claimed responsibility for a car bomb attack in Kabul, which killed 12 people, including an American soldier. Now, Trump took to Twitter to announce that Taliban leaders were due to meet him for secret talks in Camp David in U.S. He also said that he was going to meet Afghan President Ashraf Ghani separately. The U.S. President hit out at the terror group, saying that it cannot agree to a ceasefire during the important peace talks, then it probably does not have the power to negotiate a meaningful agreement anyway. He also slammed the Taliban for trying to use the Kabul Blast as a bargaining chip. Meanwhile, the Afghan government has said that the real peace will only come when Taliban ends violence and holds direct talks with Kabul. Remember, on Thursday, Taliban attacked a heavily fortified area in the Afghan capital. A Romanian NATO soldier was also killed in the blast along with an American soldier. The attack comes as U.S. nears a peace deal with the Taliban, with negotiations mainly taking place in Qatar. However, the talks have been criticized as Taliban has refused to hold negotiations with the internationally recognized Ghani government. Now, as per the draft deal, Taliban would give up arms and help in combating terror groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in exchange of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Now, this was as per the peace deal which was struck earlier, which of course stands cancelled now. The U.S. has also agreed to certain security arrangements proposed by Taliban. This as Washington looks to end its longest war. Now, the U.S. hopes that the peace talk would set tone for negotiations between the Afghan government and Taliban. However, the talks have raised fears that Taliban would dissolve human rights in Afghanistan after a deal is signed. All right, for more details, let's quickly go across to Mr. Shadi Khan, who's a journalist joining us live from Afghanistan at this moment. I'm also joined in by retired Colonel Lawrence Sellon from Montana in U.S. Let's begin by going across to Shadi at the moment. Mr. Khan, a face-to-face meeting with the Taliban at Camp David just ahead of the 18th anniversary of 9/11 would have been an extraordinary diplomatic move by the U.S. President. How surprising is the news of the cancellation of peace talks, and what happens to the U.S. troops in Afghanistan now?
Well, it's more than surprising. It's actually shocking. Nobody here, apart from those who actually knew it in the presidency, nobody can believe it that the U.S. administration was planning such a thing. The deal that was struck by the top U.S. diplomat seems it was basically opposed right from the start by the Kabul administration, because it apparently sidelined the Ghani government, and the terms that were agreed in Qatar were basically challenging the legitimacy of President Ghani, undermining the proposed presidential elections. And now, as President Trump has announced in his hallmark Twitter feeds that everything is now back to square one. So again, the country remains in uncertainty, but the cancellation has certainly boosted the morale of the Kabul administration and has sent across a feeling of relief to a greater extent across the country, actually.
All right, let's also go across to Colonel Sellon. Colonel, you just heard what my friend Shadi Khan had to say, but, you know, what happens to the U.S. troops in Afghanistan now?
Well, let me first agree with the gentleman from Afghanistan. I was very surprised that there was going to be a meeting at Camp David. Camp David is usually reserved for legitimate and respected world leaders. So this gives the Taliban a level of diplomatic recognition that it really doesn't deserve. And I was also shocked that any presidential advisor would recommend to President Trump that he get involved directly with talking to the Taliban, which in my opinion is a terrorist organization based in Pakistan.
Right.
And responsible for the killing and maiming of many Afghans and Americans. So I think there's going to be a lot of political blowback from both Democrats and Republicans for taking that position. Now, in regard to the troop disposition in Afghanistan, I think there's very little chance in the near term, certainly, that U.S. troops will be withdrawn from Afghanistan based on in the near term, based on the actions that President Trump has taken in regard to this Camp David summit.
All right. Now, let me take my next question from Shadi. Shadi, the Taliban had never agreed to end their violent campaign against Afghan and foreign forces while the peace talks were taking place, be it the Kabul car bombing that killed 12 people or the abducted 6 Afghan journalists. These are just recent examples that I'm extending at the moment. Taking these attacks into reconsideration, how do you see the peace situation actually panning out in Afghanistan?
Well, actually, there are two ways of looking at it. If we look at it from a broader perspective, the momentum that the peace talks has gained is also unprecedented. Let's not forget that as well. And the current president, President Ghani, is actually striving very hard to put an end to this war through negotiations. He has been projecting his peace deal with the Hizb-e-Islami, the Gulbuddin Hikmatyar faction, as an example of successful negotiations. Mm-hmm. So this whole surge in violence is actually coming from that, because certainly all the sides want to come and enter the negotiations from a position of strength. So a likely scenario from the point of view of an optimistic person, I believe that in the next term, if President Ghani wins election, and another if the elections indeed take place, mm-hmm. and he then spearheads the peace talks from Kabul and leads the negotiations, and we might see a peace deal indeed. It's not out of option.
All right.
But
it's interesting that you mentioned President Ghani, and that is going to bring me to my next question. Shadi, going by the latest developments, do you see an advantage for the Ghani government, which was always opposing U.S. peace talks with the Taliban? Could the latest developments also impact the election results these elections are just due in Afghanistan now?
Absolutely, not the results, but it has certainly sent across an assurance from the top backer of the Kabul administration, the U.S., that elections can indeed take place. It's less than a month away, and there were speculations, there were fears that the elections might not take place. But now that seems very much definite. Elections are going to take place, and who knows who wins. But a big uncertainty has certainly been removed now.
Right. Let me also go across to Colonel Salim. Colonel, how do you view the future of the draft peace deal now?
Well, I think it's stalled for the time being. I think the Afghan gentleman is correct in saying that the elections will go forward. I think they have to go forward now, based on what President Trump has decided in terms of the peace negotiations. So I think it also points to the fact that the Afghan government, which is the legitimate and internationally recognized government of Afghanistan, has to participate directly in these negotiations for peace, and not just a withdrawal of a certain amount of troops from Afghanistan. It has to be a peace deal based on Afghan participation and a ceasefire.
Fair enough that any peace deal has to have Afghan government participation as well. Colonel Salim, be it the Hanoi summit regarding the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula or the trade talks with China, Donald Trump is someone who is known for walking away from high-stake talks before. Will Afghanistan be another chink in the armor for a president who promised to withdraw troops as part of his election promise in 2016?
Well, this could also be a negotiating tactic by President Trump. Remember, President Trump is a businessman, and one of the business principles is knowing when to walk away from the deal. So I think we all see that there is a need for peace in Afghanistan. This may be a temporary setback, but it may put negotiations back on track, because President Trump took the courageous decision to stop things for the time being, allow the Afghan elections to go forward, and then see what happens.
All right, let me go across to Shadi. Shadi, as a journalist, we all are aware of the fact that, 6 Afghan journalists have just been abducted by the Taliban. What is going to be the future of these journalists at this crucial point now?
Well, luckily enough, those 6 journalists who were abducted from Paktia province last evening, they have been released by the Taliban, but the media community as a whole, in fact, the whole civil society remains on the edge. They face threats, they face attacks, and the situation for them remains tense. Before this abduction, a human rights activist, a prominent young guy from Ghor province, was killed. So the Taliban, it's important to note that it's not a very disciplined guerrilla organization. Some of their field commanders can, take actions on personal level. You never know. Right. But luckily, these 6 journalists, they have been released now.
All right, so that's some good news coming in from you, as you've just confirmed that those 6 journalists who had been abducted have been released. So that is, of course, some respite for those journalists and the families. Now, my last question, Colonel Selling, to you. Some in Afghanistan fear that any deal could see hard-won rights and freedoms eroded and the Taliban back in power. But after today, Afghanistan is staring back at an abyss. Is Afghanistan now more dangerous than ever?
Well, it certainly is more dangerous than it has been. And I think we have to take that into account, and the fact that the Taliban, despite the peace negotiations, is continuing to pursue a military solution in Afghanistan. And that is because they can't win elections. So their only path to power is through violence. And I think this is what we need to recognize and need to deal with.
All right, Colonel Selling, thank you so much for all those details. Let me take my last question from Mr. Khan. Mr. Khan, what could finally bring peace in Afghanistan in the future? Your closing comments.
Well, nothing can be said for sure, but one thing is there is a hope that the elections take place and a more stronger and unified government takes position in Kabul, and then it leads negotiations with the Taliban. But before that, a ceasefire should be implemented, and negotiations in peace environment can well put an end to this war.
All right, negotiations in a peaceful environment is the only way out, and of course a unified civilian government. Thank you so much, Mr. Shadi Khan and Colonel Lawrence Selling, for joining us here on this discussion on World is One. We thoroughly appreciate your comments. And with that, it's a wrap of this newscast. Thank you so much for joining. News and updates continue on World is One.